The hearing room in the Dirksen Senate office building was not just crowded, it was suffocating. The air inside was heavy, recycled, and charged with the kind of static electricity that precedes a violent storm. Every inch of mahogany bench space in the public gallery was occupied. The press section was a chaotic sea of lenses, laptops, and boom microphones overflowing into the aisles. Reporters who usually covered mundane subcommittee markups were jostling for position, knowing that what was about to happen would lead the evening news cycle globally. The buzz of anticipation was a physical hum, a collective murmur of hundreds of people whispering at once. Then, the heavy oak doors swung open, and the room fell into a sudden, jagged silence. Vice President JD Vance entered. He didn't walk with the hurried, frantic energy of a legislator late for a vote. He moved with the slow, deliberate cadence of the second-highest executive in the land. Flanked by Secret Service agents who peeled off to the sides, the Vice President climbed the steps to the raised dais. In a rare and dramatic move, the Vice President himself was presiding over this special inquiry, lending the full weight of the White House to the proceedings. He arranged his papers with geometric precision, stacking them into neat piles, and sat down. He didn't smile for the cameras. He didn't wave to colleagues. He simply stared down at the witness table. Sitting there, isolated in the harsh glare of the television lights, was Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. She looked small against the backdrop of the massive room. Her lawyer was leaning in close, whispering urgently into her ear, his hand covering his mouth. Omar nodded tightly, her face a mask of tension. She adjusted her hijab, then her microphone, then her papers. It was a nervous tick. She knew what was coming. For 7 years, she had dismissed scandals as Islamophobia. For 7 years, she had dodged questions about her finances and her rhetoric. But today, she wasn't facing a committee chairman. She was facing the Vice President of the United States. There was no Twitter block button here. There was only the sworn oath she had just taken, still hanging in the air like smoke. The red light on the Vice President's microphone flickered to life. "Congresswoman," Vice President Vance began, his voice low but cutting through the silence effortlessly. "You've made a career of claiming victimhood. It is your shield and your sword. But today, we're not going to talk about your feelings. We're going to discuss actual victims." Vance paused, letting his eyes sweep over the gallery, commanding the room with absolute authority. The families who lost loved ones on September 11th. The teachers whose school funds you helped steal. The constituents you represent who live in poverty while you became a millionaire. But let's start with the money. Vance picked up the first document from his stack. The sound of the paper rustling was the only noise in the room. "We have a lot of ground to cover today, Congresswoman. 7 years of financial irregularities, broken laws, ethical violations, and a pattern, a very clear, undeniable pattern of you enriching yourself while claiming to fight for the poor." He looked directly at her. She tried to hold his gaze, but the weight of his office and his stare was too much. Her eyes flickered away, focusing on a spot on the table. "Let me start with something simple. A question you've dodged for 5 years now. Your husband's consulting firm, the E Street Group. Your campaign paid them over $3 million in 2020. Is that correct?" Omar shifted in her seat. She leaned into the microphone, her voice taking on that familiar, condescending pitch she used when she felt cornered, half an octave higher, as if explaining quantum physics to a toddler. "Mr. Vice President, I think that's—" "Yes or no, please," Vance interrupted. His tone wasn't angry, it was bored, the tone of a prosecutor who already had the bank records. $3 million from your campaign to your husband's firm. Correct. The amount is $3 million. Yes or no? She couldn't answer. To say yes was to admit the scale of the grift. To say no was perjury. She froze, caught in the trap within the first 60 seconds. Those were legitimate consulting expenses, she stammered, pivoting to her talking points. $3 million, Vice President Vance repeated, ignoring her deflection. He let the number sit there, heavy and unavoidable. $3 million paid to your husband while you were having an affair with him, according to his ex-wife's divorce filing, while both of you were still married to 2 other people. The room stirred. A gasp rippled through the back rows. Someone in the press section coughed to cover a laugh of disbelief. Cameras clicked furiously. Shutter, 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 capturing the look of panic in Omar's eyes. This was the money shot. This was why they had lined up since 4 a.m. That's a personal matter, Mr. Vice President, Omar snapped, her defenses rising, trying to inject authority into her voice, but failing. It becomes a public matter when you use campaign funds, Vance corrected her instantly, his voice resonating with the full power of the executive branch. Federal Election Commission rules are very clear. Campaign funds cannot be used for personal expenses, personal relationships, or personal benefit. But let's walk through the timeline, because it's fascinating. Really fascinating. Vance pulled a specific sheet from his stack. He held it up, showing a timeline chart with red bars indicating payments. August 2018. The first payment to his firm, the E Street Group, hits the ledger. $230,000. That same month, his ex-wife, Beth Minot, states in court filings that you two started the affair. Coincidence? Omar opened her mouth to speak, closed it, then opened it again. Her lawyer whispered something sharp and urgent. Don't answer that. She sat back, trying to compose herself, smoothing the fabric of her jacket. I don't have to respond to allegations about my private life, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Under oath, Vance reminded her, leaning forward. Congresswoman, you took an oath 20 minutes ago. You remember that part? The lawyer whispered again. Omar looked desperate. Those payments were for digital consulting, fundraising services, she insisted, grasping for the technical defense. Services? Right. Let's talk about those services, Vice President Vance said, adjusting his reading glasses. He leaned forward, his elbows on the dais, closing the physical distance between them. We have your campaign finance reports, every single one, from August 2018 through November 2020. And do you want to know what's interesting? The payments to his firm track perfectly with his travel schedule, the travel his ex-wife documented in her divorce filing. Vance looked down at his notes, running his finger along the dates. September 2018. Your campaign pays the E Street Group $42,000 for travel expenses. That same week, Beth Minot notes in her filing, my husband traveled to California, claimed it was work. Later, he admitted he was with you. Her words, not mine. Same week, $42,000. Omar's jaw tightened, the muscles working visibly beneath her skin. You could see the crack in the facade. The Slay Queen persona was evaporating under the heat of forensic accounting. Mr. Vice President, you're conflating. October, Vance continued, bulldozing over her objection with the momentum of a freight train. Campaign pays $68,000. That same month, Beth Minot says her husband told her he was leaving her for you. Quote, he's romantically involved with Representative Omar. End quote. $68,000 that month. The pattern was relentless. Vice President Vance walked through the calendar, month by month, each payment larger than the last, each corresponding to a trip, a meeting, a getaway where Tim Minot was supposedly doing campaign work, but was actually conducting a romantic relationship with his client. By the time Vance reached March 2019, the month the divorce was filed, the total had already exceeded $500,000. $600,000 in 7 months, Vance summarized, his voice stern. That is the cost of your affair, Congresswoman, and the American people paid for it. The echoes of the timeline Vice President Vance had just laid out were still bouncing off the wood-paneled walls. $600,000 in 7 months. The audience was doing the math in their heads, realizing that this wasn't just a rounding error. It was a fortune. But the vice president wasn't done with the numbers. He was about to put them into a context that made the corruption undeniable. Here's what makes it interesting, Congresswoman, Vance said, leaning back in his chair. He adopted a tone of genuine curiosity, but coming from the vice president, it felt more like an interrogation than a query. Your previous consultants, the ones you employed before you started sleeping with Mr. Minot, they charged you $60,000 for an entire election cycle. That's for digital ads, fundraising, mailers, the whole package. $60,000 total. Vance let the number hang in the air for a full 5 seconds, ensuring even the viewers at home felt the weight of it. This firm, your boyfriend's firm, charged $3 million for 1 cycle. He held up 3 fingers, his hand steady. That is 50 times more expensive. 50 times. Now, either Tim Minot is the greatest political consultant in the history of the American Republic, a genius who reinvented the art of campaigning, or, well, I think we can use our imaginations. A laugh broke out in the gallery. It started with one person, a sharp, incredulous bark of laughter, and then spread. It was the laughter of realization. The absurdity of the discrepancy was too great to ignore. Even the press corps, usually stoic, were exchanging glances. 50 times? Those are market rates, Omar said, her voice tight and defensive. She sounded like she was reciting a line from a legal brief she hadn't fully read, desperate to place a barrier between herself and the man on the dais. Market rates? Vance nodded slowly, mimicking the look of a professor listening to a failing student try to bluff their way through an oral exam. Let me ask you this. Did you bid out the work? Did you get competing quotes? Did you shop around to see if anyone could do it for, say, $2 million? Or maybe $100,000? Silence. The question hung there, unanswered. Omar's lawyer whispered frantically, his pen tapping on his legal pad. She shook her head slightly. No, Vice President Vance said, answering for her. I'll take that silence as a no. Because of course you didn't. You hired your boyfriend. You paid him millions in campaign funds. Then you married him. Then you paid his firm even more. Over $1 million additional dollars since 2020. Mr. Vice President, this is harassment, Omar tried, playing the victim card again, hoping the title would sound like a plea for decorum. Let me ask you something else, Vance countered, his voice hardening, stripping away any pretense of pleasantry. The Federal Election Commission received a complaint about this. You know they couldn't investigate at the time because they lacked a quorum of commissioners. Very convenient for you. But the complaint laid it out clearly. Vance leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers with the intensity that had propelled him to the White House. Do you know what is considered a personal expense under federal law? It's defined as anything that would exist regardless of the campaign. Like, say, your boyfriend's travel to meet you, his hotel rooms when he stayed with you, his meals when you were dating. All of that is personal. It is illegal to pay for it with campaign funds, but you paid millions. The air in the room felt thicker, heavier. You could hear the intake of breath from the audience. This wasn't just unethical. The vice president was laying out the framework for a criminal indictment on national television. So, we have $3 million in 2020. Over $1 million since then. Total, $4.3 million from your campaign. Money donated by everyday Americans, waitresses, teachers, students who believed in you, who thought you were fighting for them. You took their $20 donations and you funneled millions of them to your husband. Vance reached under the dais and pulled out a large printed poster board. He propped it up on an easel next to him. It was a screenshot of a website. "Want to hear the best part?" Vance asked, gesturing to the image. "This is the E Street Group's website. I had my staff archive it yesterday. Look at it." The gallery craned their necks. The website was comically bad. It was a single landing page. No links, no portfolio, no team photos, no case studies. Just a logo and a generic Contact Us form. Minimal, barely functional, no client list. Vance listed off the deficiencies, his voice dripping with executive disdain. No office address, just a digital placeholder. That is the firm you paid $4.3 million to. A firm with a broken website and no visible work product except for your campaigns. Vance turned back to Omar. "So, let me ask you directly, under oath. Were these payments legitimate consulting fees for work actually performed? Or were they a sophisticated way to funnel campaign money into your joint bank account?" She couldn't look at him. She stared at the polished wood of the table, her hands clutching her pen so hard her knuckles were white. Her lawyer whispered again, but she shook her head. "I need an answer, Congresswoman," Vance pressed. "Yes or no?" "We followed all applicable laws," she recited, robotic and hollow. "That's not what I asked," Vance snapped. "Were they legitimate, or were they personal expenses disguised as consulting fees?" The silence stretched. 10 seconds. 20. A chair scraped loudly against the tile floor in the back of the room. I don't have to answer," she finally whispered. "You do," Vance corrected, "but I'll note your refusal to answer for the record." The vice president picked up a pen and made a deliberate check mark on his notes. The scratching sound was amplified by the microphone, a sound of judgment from the highest levels of government. "Let's move on," Vance said, flipping the page. "Because the federal government wasn't the only one watching you. The Minnesota Campaign Finance Board actually had the power to investigate. And unlike the FEC, they found something very interesting." At the back of the room, a door clicked open and then shut. A senior staffer from Omar's office was leaving, walking away, abandoning the ship before it fully sank. The sound of their footsteps fading down the marble hallway outside was the only thing competing with the vice president's voice. "Your tax dollars at work," Vance muttered, watching the door close. "Let's talk about the state violations." The sound of the door clicking shut behind the fleeing staffer seemed to signal a shift in the room's atmosphere. The air grew colder, the tension sharpening from broad political theater into specific, undeniable forensic accounting. Vice President Vance didn't look up at the exit. His focus remained entirely on the witness table, his eyes drilling into the Congresswoman. "Let's talk about the Minnesota Campaign Finance and Public Disclosure Board," Vance said, enunciating the full title with deliberate slowness. "That's a mouthful, I know. Let's just call them the watchdogs, the people whose job is to make sure state politicians follow the law, follow the rules, don't steal from their campaigns." Vance reached under the dais and produced a new document. This one wasn't a flimsy printout. It was a thick, bound report stamped with the official seal of the state of Minnesota. He held it up, letting the cameras catch the seal, before dropping it onto his desk with a heavy thud. Simple stuff, really, Vance mused, flipping the cover open. Don't use campaign money for personal vacations. Don't use it to fix your tax returns. Basic ethics. Kindergarten-level ethics. The kind of thing you'd think a state representative would understand, without needing a remedial course. He began to flip through the pages, the rustle of paper amplifying the silence in the room. He was making her wait, letting the anxiety build. June 7, 2019, Vance read, his finger tracing a line of text. The board issued their ruling. You know what they found? Let me read it directly into the record. Quote, the board found that Representative Omar improperly used campaign funds. Improperly. That's the polite, bureaucratic way of saying illegally. For personal out-of-state travel and personal expenses. End quote. Vance looked up, removing his reading glasses to stare directly at Omar. There it is, Congresswoman. Black and white. An official ruling. You broke the law. Omar bristled, her posture stiffening. Mr. Vice President, that was a minor administrative error. We rectified it immediately. Minor? Vance raised an eyebrow. The board ordered you to repay $3,169.23 plus a $500 civil penalty. Almost $4,000. You stole almost $4,000 from your state campaign for personal use. To the average family in your district, $4,000 isn't minor. It's a life-changing amount of money. And you took it. The word hung there, heavy and accusatory. Illegal. Not alleged. Not disputed. Ruled. Found. Decided. Let's walk through what you actually did, Vance continued relentless. June 2017. Your campaign pays for airfare to New York City. $600. For what? To attend a People for the American Way event. America's cabinet. Very progressive. Very nice. I'm sure the cocktails were excellent. A ripple of laughter moved through the press section, quickly stifled. But here's the thing, Vance said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. It had nothing to do with your job as a Minnesota state representative. Nothing. The board found, and I'm quoting here, while Representative Omar would not have been asked to participate had she not been elected, she did not attend this event to assist her in the performance of her duties as a legislator. End quote. Vance leaned back, crossing his arms. Translation. You used campaign money for a personal trip. Your campaign paid for you to go to a nice event in New York, to network, socialize, and build your brand. All personal. All illegal. The board disagrees with your characterization, Omar interjected weakly. They investigated. They ruled. You broke the law, Vance shot back. But wait, there's more. He flipped a page, the sound crisp in the quiet room. A trip to Florida. Your campaign pays for it. You go down there to accept an honorarium. You got paid to give a speech. That's income. Personal income for Ilhan Omar. But your campaign paid for the flight and the hotel. You pocketed the speaking fee while the donors paid your expenses. That's called double-dipping, Congresswoman. The board said no. Illegal. Chicago. Vance listed the next item, picking up speed. Another trip. Campaign pays. You go to accept an award and attend a fundraising luncheon. An award for you personally. Fundraising for other organizations. Nothing to do with representing your Minnesota district. Nothing to do with serving your constituents. Campaign pays. You benefit. Illegal. Washington, D.C. hotel room. Campaign pays. You're there for a Girl Up UN conference interview. Girl Up, United Nations, international organization. Nothing to do with the Minnesota State Legislature. Nothing to do with state law. Nothing to do with your actual job. Your campaign paid for your hotel. Illegal. Each example hit like a hammer blow. Methodical. Relentless. The weight building with each citation. The gallery was absorbing it. You could feel the mood shifting, the murmurs growing, people whispering to each other, the sound building like a wave crashing against the shore. "But my personal favorite," Vance said, pausing to let a grim smile touch his lips. "This one is special. $1,500 paid to a law firm. Not for campaign work, not for legal advice about your legislative duties. For what?" He milked the pause, staring at the cameras. "To fix mistakes on your personal tax returns." He enunciated each word separately, making sure everyone heard. Personal, tax, returns. You had tax problems, errors, mistakes, whatever you want to call them. You needed a lawyer to fix them. So, instead of writing a check from your personal bank account, you paid for it with campaign money. Money people donated to get you elected to help you serve them. Not to fix your personal taxes. Not to clean up your own financial mess. You used their money for yourself. The gallery was murmuring louder now, quiet but growing. People were processing what they were hearing. "What makes all this interesting, Congresswoman, is the pattern," Vance said, leaning forward. "Because it's the same pattern we saw in round one. Campaign money flowing into your personal life, your personal relationships, your personal expenses, your personal travel, your personal taxes, everything personal. Nothing about serving constituents, nothing about legislation, nothing about making life better for Minnesotans. Mr. Vice President, those were honest mistakes." She tried again, her voice straining. "The board didn't call them honest mistakes," Vance countered instantly. "They called them violations. They fined you. They ordered you to repay. That's not a mistake. That's a choice." "It was a learning experience," she said, reverting to the script. "You're not a child," Vance snapped, his voice sharp and cutting. "You went to North Dakota State. You served in the Minnesota House. You knew the rules. You chose to break them. Honest mistakes don't involve writing a $2,500 check for your personal tax problems." Her face was reddening, her voice climbing again. "This is clearly a politically motivated—" "The Minnesota Campaign Finance Board is a nonpartisan state agency established by law," Vance interrupted, silencing her. "Democrats and Republicans both serve on it. They investigated a complaint filed by a Republican, sure, but they found the facts. They made their ruling. Those are facts, Congresswoman, not politics." Vance closed the report. "Here's what bothers me most. After the board ruled against you, after they found you broke the law, you issued a statement. Remember what you said?" He didn't wait for an answer. Quote, "We have been collaborative in this process." Collaborative? Like you were doing them a favor? Like you were helping them investigate your own crimes? Then you said, and I love this part, the report showed that none of the money was used for personal use. End quote. Vance looked up, staring at her with disbelief. Except it was. Every single violation they found was personal use. Personal travel, personal taxes, all of it personal. You lied, again. Even in your apology statement, you lied to your constituents. "You paid the fine," Vance concluded, tossing the report aside. $3,369 total. Barely a week's worth of your salary. Pocket change. No real consequences. No jail time. No removal from office. Just a slap on the wrist. And what did you learn? Based on everything that came after, nothing. You learned nothing because you kept doing it. Federal level? Bigger amounts? Same pattern? Same playbook? Use campaign money for personal benefit? Another door opened in the back. More footsteps. 2 more people leaving. The exodus was starting. Slow but steady. People walking away from her. "Let's talk about the 9/11 comments," Vance said, his tone shifting from forensic to something far darker. "Because there's someone in this room who wants to ask you about that directly." The shift in Vice President Vance's demeanor was instantaneous and chilling. If the previous segment had been the cold, clinical dissection of a financial audit, this was something else entirely. The air in the room didn't just feel heavy, it felt sacred, charged with a sudden, somber gravity. Vance sat back, his hands clasped on the desk, his expression hardening into the controlled fury of a man who had worn the uniform. "Some people did something," Vance said. 5 words. He let them hang in the air, echoing off the high ceilings. 5 words that managed to minimize the worst terrorist attack on American soil. 5 words that reduced 19 hijackers, 4 commercial airliners, 2 towers, and 2,977 dead Americans to a throwaway line. Some people did something, like it was a fender bender, a minor inconvenience on a Tuesday morning. The room was frozen. Nobody was moving. Even the photographers seemed to pause, sensing the volatility of the moment. "March 23, 2019, Vance recited from memory, not needing to look at his notes. "A CARE fundraiser in California. You're giving a speech. You're working the progressive base, talking about discrimination, civil liberties, Muslim Americans as second-class citizens, all very noble topics. Then you say it." Vance picked up a small index card. Quote, "CAIR was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties." End quote. He dropped the card. First problem, CAIR wasn't founded after 9/11. It was founded in 1994. You got the basic history wrong. But that's not the important part. Nobody cares about the date. The important part is how you describe the murder of nearly 3,000 people. Vance leaned forward, his voice dropping to a register that vibrated with suppressed emotion. "Let's be very clear about what 9/11 was, Congresswoman. 19 al-Qaeda terrorists, trained in Afghanistan, funded by Osama bin Laden, organized, coordinated. They hijacked 4 planes. American citizens were on board. Families, children, people going to work, people going home." Vance paused, looking up at the gallery, his eyes misting slightly, but his jaw set like granite. "They flew 2 planes into the World Trade Center towers in Manhattan, another into the Pentagon. A 4th crashed in a field in Pennsylvania after passengers, heroes, fought back. 2,977 people died, 343 firefighters, 60 police officers, citizens from 77 different countries. They kissed their families goodbye. They got on trains. They rode elevators. They sat at desks. And they never came home. They were vaporized. They jumped from burning windows holding hands." The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear people breathing, the weight of the memory pressing down on everyone. "That is what happened," Vance whispered. "That is what 'some people did something' actually means. That is what you dismissed." "President Trump retweeted a video of your speech," Vance continued, his voice returning to a steady command. "Your quote, followed by footage of the attacks, the planes hitting, the towers falling, the smoke, the horror. His caption, 'We will never forget.' The video got 10 million views in 24 hours. You said the tweet increased death threats against you. Maybe it did. That's serious. Nobody should receive death threats. Violence is wrong." Vance turned his gaze to the third row of the public gallery. But you know what else happened? 9/11 families heard what you said. They heard a sitting member of Congress dismiss their loved ones' murders as something done by some people. They were devastated, furious, heartbroken all over again. Vance extended a hand toward the gallery. Nicholas Harros, Jr., Vance announced. September 11, 2019, the 18th anniversary of the attacks. Ground Zero Memorial Ceremony. His mother, Frances Harros, died in the North Tower. She was 76 years old. She went to work that Tuesday morning and never came home. Nicholas was there to read names. But first, he wanted to address you. Vance looked directly at a man sitting in the third row. He was in his 60s, with gray hair and a strong jawline. He was wearing a black T-shirt with white text printed clearly across the chest. The text read, "Some people did something." "Mr. Harros," Vice President Vance said, his voice respectful and soft. "Would you like to stand?" The man stood up. The sound of fabric rustling and the chair creaking was deafening in the silence. He stood tall, dignified, years of grief compressed into a steely composure. He walked to a microphone that had been set up in the aisle of the gallery. His footsteps echoed. Everyone was watching him. "Congresswoman Omar," Harros said. His voice cracked slightly, then held firm. It was strong, clear. "You said some people did something. I want to make sure you understand exactly who did what to whom." Omar looked up. She saw him. She saw the shirt. Her face went pale, actually pale, the color draining from her cheeks. She looked like she wanted to disappear. On September 11, 2001, 19 Islamic terrorists, members of Al-Qaeda, killed over 3,000 people and caused billions of dollars in economic damage, Harros said, staring straight at her. "My mother was one of them. Frances Harros. She was an office manager at Marsh & McLennan, 96th floor, North Tower." Harros's hands were shaking now, gripping the microphone stand. Not from fear, but from rage held barely in check. She went to work. She did her job. She helped people. She answered phones. And 19 men, 19 terrorists following Osama bin Laden's orders. They murdered her. They flew a plane into her building, and they murdered her. You could hear crying in the gallery now. Quiet sobs, sniffles, someone blowing their nose. "That's not something," Harros said, his voice rising. "That's mass murder. That's terrorism. That's evil. And those weren't some people. They were terrorists. Radical Islamic terrorists who declared war on America, on civilization, on everything decent." He paused, composing himself. "They murdered my mother. They murdered my friend's parents. They murdered children. You want to talk about civil liberties? My mother's civil liberties were shredded when American Airlines Flight 11 hit her building. Her liberty to live, to breathe, to see her grandchildren grow up, to retire, to enjoy life. All gone, stolen, because some people did something." Harros stared at Omar. She couldn't meet his eyes. She stared at her hands, trapped, broken. "Do you understand now, Congresswoman?" Harros asked quietly. "Do you understand why your words hurt? Why they were offensive? Why families like mine felt like you spit on our loved ones' graves?" Omar opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Her throat moved, swallowing dryly. "I'd like an answer, please," Harros said. "Do you understand?" Yes," she whispered. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "You said it in a speech to a large audience with cameras rolling," Vance interjected from the dais, his voice like a gavel. "You meant it. You just didn't think anyone would call you on it. You thought you could say it to your base and nobody else would hear. But we heard. The families heard. America heard. Vance let the silence hold. 30 seconds. 40. Harros was still standing, still staring at Omar, a living monument to the consequences of her rhetoric. "Thank you, Mr. Harros," Vance said finally, "for being here, for your courage, for making sure your mother's memory is honored." Harros nodded once, a sharp military nod, and walked back to his seat. You could hear every footstep. After that memorial service, after Mr. Harros confronted you wearing that shirt, you went on CBS, Face the Nation. You were asked if you understood why families were offended. Vance picked up his notes. You said, quote, "I certainly could not understand the weight of the pain." End quote. Could not. Can't. You still can't understand, even after 18 years. Even after Mr. Harros just explained it to you. You still don't get it. "I do understand," she started to argue. "No, you don't," Vance cut her off. "Because if you understood, you would have apologized. Really apologized. Not the non-apology you gave. Not the "I'm sorry if people were offended" garbage. A real apology. "I was wrong. My words were cruel. I minimized the worst attack on American soil. I hurt families who are still grieving. I'm sorry." Vance counted the sentences on his fingers. 5 simple sentences. You never gave them. You never will. Because you don't think you were wrong. You think you're the victim. 3 more people stood up in the gallery and walked out. One of them slammed the heavy oak door. Bang! The sound echoed like a gunshot. "Some people did something," Vance murmured. "Let's talk about the anti-Semitism. Because there's a pattern here, too. A pattern of you minimizing atrocities. A pattern of you dismissing pain. And it's even uglier." The silence that followed Nicholas Harros Jr.'s testimony was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, and filled with a collective sense of shame. He had walked back to his seat with the dignity of a man who had carried a burden for 18 years, leaving Congresswoman Omar alone at the witness table, stripped of her usual political armor. Vice President Vance didn't rush to fill the void. He let the moment linger, forcing the cameras to stay fixed on Omar's face, which was now turned downward, staring at her hands. The slay queen of social media, the firebrand of the squad, looked diminished. "Mr. Harros," Vance said softly, acknowledging the man in the gallery one last time. "Thank you." Vance turned his gaze back to the witness. "Congresswoman, after that memorial service in 2019, after seeing a son read his mother's name while wearing a shirt with your words on it, you went on television. Specifically, you went on CBS's Face the Nation. You were given a primetime opportunity to fix this, to heal the wound." Vance picked up a transcript from his desk. "You were asked directly if you understood why families like Mr. Harros's were offended. And this is what you said. Quote, "I certainly could not understand the weight of the pain." End quote. Vance dropped the paper. It fluttered to the desk, the sound crisp in the quiet room. "Could not. Can't. You told a national audience that you, a sitting member of the United States Congress, lacked the capacity to understand why dismissing mass murder would hurt the victims' families. You framed it as an intellectual puzzle you couldn't quite solve." "I do understand," Omar whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. "No, you don't," Vance corrected her, his voice rising in volume and intensity. "Because if you understood, you would have apologized. And I mean really apologized. Not the non-apology you gave. Not the "I'm sorry if people were offended" garbage that your communications director wrote for you. Not the I'm the real victim here, deflection you use every time you get caught. Vance leaned forward, holding up his hand, ticking off points on his fingers. A real apology looks like this. I was wrong. My words were cruel. I minimized the worst attack on American soil. I hurt families who are still grieving. I am sorry. 5 sentences. That's it. He waited. You never gave that apology. You never will. Because deep down, you don't think you were wrong. You think you're the victim. You think you are the one being persecuted because people noticed what you said. Omar looked up, her eyes flashing with a spark of her old defiance. Mr. Vice President, I have faced death threats. I have faced hatred. And that is terrible, Vance interrupted, cutting off her pivot. But receiving threats does not absolve you of the pain you cause others. You use your own victimhood as a shield to deflect from your own cruelty. Mr. Harros didn't threaten you. He just asked you to listen. And instead of listening, you went on TV and said you couldn't understand his pain. At the back of the room, the heavy oak doors opened again. The sound was distinct. The click of the latch, the groan of the hinges. Heads turned. 3 more people stood up in the gallery. They weren't press. They weren't Republican operatives. They were young, diverse, wearing pins that looked like campaign buttons, former supporters, people who had likely knocked on doors for her in Minneapolis. They stood up in a silent block, gathered their coats, and walked out. They didn't slam the door. They didn't shout. They just left. It was a silent vote of no confidence, broadcast live to the world. The image of her own base walking away from her was more damaging than any soundbite. Vance watched them go, his expression unreadable. They're leaving, Congresswoman, Vance observed quietly. Not because they hate you, but because they see you. Finally, clearly, they see you. He shuffled his papers, signaling a shift. The emotional weight of 9/11 was settling, but Vance was already moving the target. Some people did something, Vance murmured, shaking his head. That phrase revealed a mindset that minimizes atrocities committed by people you sympathize with and maximizes grievances against people you don't. He pulled a new folder from his stack. It was labeled Rhetoric and Conduct. Let's talk about the anti-Semitism, Vance said, his voice hardening into steel. Because there is a pattern here too. A pattern of you dismissing pain. A pattern of you using ancient ugly tropes to attack a specific group of people. And it's even uglier than the 9/11 comments because you keep doing it over and over again. Vance opened the folder. 2012. You're not in Congress yet. You're a state representative, just starting out. But you have opinions, strong opinions about Israel, about Jews, so you take to Twitter. Vance picked up a smartphone, holding it up as a prop, though the text was displayed on the large screens behind him. Quote, Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them see the evil doings of Israel. End quote. Hypnotized the world, Vance repeated, looking over his reading glasses. That isn't a policy critique, Congresswoman. That is a classic anti-Semitic trope. The idea that Jews possess some mystical secret power to control minds, to deceive the masses, to hypnotize the globe. It's been around for centuries. It's the stuff of the protocols of the elders of Zion. It's the stuff of Nazi propaganda. And you just updated it for the Twitter age. Omar shifted uncomfortably, her lawyer whispering in her ear again. That was taken out of context, she stammered. It was during a conflict. I was expressing frustration. It's a complete sentence, Vance shot back. There is no context where accusing the Jewish state of hypnotizing the world isn't anti-Semitic. You apologized for that one eventually. Years later, after you got elected to Congress, after the pressure became too great. Very big of you. A snort of derision came from the press section. But that was just the warm-up, Vance said. Because once you got to Washington, once you had the platform of a United States Congresswoman, you didn't stop. You doubled down. February 2019, Vice President Vance announced, setting the scene for the next indictment. You are now a freshman representative, a superstar of the progressive movement. You have the cover of The Squad. You have the adoration of the media. And you just can't help yourself. Vance pulled out a printed exchange of tweets, blown up on poster board. Journalist Glenn Greenwald tweets about how much time Congress spends defending Israel. It's a standard progressive critique of foreign policy. Fine. That's political debate. But you couldn't leave it at that. You quoted his tweet and added your own commentary. Vance read the words that were now looming large on the screen behind him. Quote, "It's all about the Benjamin's baby." End quote. With a music note emoji. Benjamins, Vance explained for the record, though everyone knew what it meant. Slang for $100 bills. Money. Cash. When a user asked you to clarify who you thought was paying American politicians to be pro-Israel, you replied with one word. AIPAC. Exclamation point. The American Israel Public Affairs Committee. Vance set the pointer down and leaned his elbows on the desk, staring directly at her. You just accused the entire United States Congress of being bought off. But you didn't say defense contractors. You didn't say oil lobbyists. You went straight to the Jews. Mr. Vice President, my criticism was about the influence of money in politics, Omar argued, her voice rising, trying to find footing on the policy ground. Lobbying is a problem in this country. You didn't criticize lobbying tactics, Vance countered sharply. You didn't criticize policy positions. You used a specific ugly slur. You said it was all about the Benjamins. That is the oldest anti-Semitic trope in the book. Jewish money buying control. Jewish money pulling the strings. It's right up there with hypnotizing the world. The backlash was immediate, Vance continued. And here is what is critical for the record. It wasn't just Republicans. It wasn't just Islamophobes attacking you. It was your own party, your own leadership. Vance pulled out a document with the congressional seal of the Speaker's office from the previous administration. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Majority Leader Steny Hoyer, Majority Whip Jim Clyburn. Every single member of the Democratic leadership issued a joint statement condemning you. Let me read what your own team said about you. Vance put on his glasses. Quote, "Anti-Semitism is real, and I am grateful for Jewish neighbors and colleagues who are educating me on the painful history of anti-Semitic tropes. We condemn these remarks and call upon Congresswoman Omar to immediately apologize for these hurtful comments." End quote. Vance looked up. That was Nancy Pelosi. That was Chuck Schumer, Senate Minority Leader at the time, a Jewish man from New York. He said your comments were offensive and irresponsible. He said intolerance has no place in Congress. Chelsea Clinton called you out. The Forward, a progressive Jewish publication that agrees with you on almost every other issue, condemned you. Everyone said you crossed a line, Vance said. And what did you do? I apologized, Omar interrupted, finally finding a moment to speak. I issued an unqualified apology. After you were forced to, Vance corrected instantly. After every major Democrat told you that you were becoming a liability. After you realized your committee assignments were at risk. You didn't apologize because you had a revelation, Congresswoman. You apologized because you got caught. And we know that because you kept doing it. Vance flipped the page. 1 month later, March 2019, a town hall event at Bus Boys and Poets in D.C. You're back in front of a friendly crowd. You think the storm is past, so you let the mask slip again. Vance read from his notes, quote, I want to talk about the political influence in this country that says it is okay to push for allegiance to a foreign country. End quote. Allegiance to a foreign country, Vance repeated, letting the words hang in the air like toxic smoke. Dual loyalty, Vance interpreted. The accusation that American Jews are more loyal to Israel than to America. Another ancient trope, literally used in Nazi Germany to strip Jews of their citizenship, used in the Dreyfus Affair in France, used to question whether Jews can ever be real patriots. And you just said it out loud to a room full of people. The House of Representatives had to pass a resolution because of you, Vance said, shaking his head in disbelief. Resolution 183, condemning anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, and bigotry. They couldn't even censure you by name because your squad protected you, but everyone in this building knew who that resolution was for. It was for you. The gallery was restless now. The murmurs were growing into a buzz of anger. Fast forward to 2023, Vance said. Republicans take the House. One of the first acts of the new Speaker was removing you from the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Why? Quote, for her numerous anti-Semitic and other problematic statements regarding the United States Democratic ally, Israel. End quote. And what was your defense? Vance asked. Did you reflect? Did you learn? No. You claimed it was Islamophobia. You claimed you were being targeted because you were a Muslim woman. Not because you accused Jews of hypnotizing the world. Not because you accused them of buying Congress with Benjamins. Not because you questioned their loyalty to America. No, it must be because of your identity. Do you believe your comments about Israel and Jewish influence were anti-Semitic? Vance asked directly. I believe they were mischaracterized by bad faith actors, Omar said, reverting to her prepared line. That's not what I asked, Vance snapped. Were they anti-Semitic? Did they rely on negative stereotypes about Jewish people? My criticism was about policy. You didn't mention policy, Vance roared, slamming his hand on the desk. You talked about money. You talked about hypnosis. You talked about allegiance. That is not policy. That is bigotry. Do you believe Jewish Americans have inappropriate financial influence over U.S. policy toward Israel? Vance pressed, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. I believe lobbying is a problem, she started. Stop hiding behind generalities, Vance ordered. Do you believe Jews are buying political influence? I never said Jews. I said AIPAC. A predominantly Jewish organization, Vance noted. You said Benjamins. Stop playing word games. Your silence speaks volumes. Vance sat back, looking at her with total disdain. Let's move on to how you got rich, Vance said, signaling the next phase of the dissection. Because since you seem so interested in talking about Benjamins and money in politics, I think it's time we talked about yours. And that is a fascinating story. More doors opened in the back, more footsteps leaving. A section of her original supporters, 5 people, stood up as a group and filed out together. The exodus was becoming a flood. The room had thinned out noticeably. The exodus of the disillusioned supporters had left gaps in the gallery benches, like missing teeth in a smile. But the press section remained packed, sensing that Vice President Vance was moving from ideological crimes to financial ones, the kind that put people in prison, not just in headlines. "Let's talk about your financial disclosure forms," Vance said, his voice shifting to a dry, forensic tone. "These are fascinating documents. Every member of Congress has to file them annually. It's the law. You list your assets, your investments, your income sources, your spouse's business interests. It is the bedrock of transparency." Vance held up a thick manila folder. "It lets your constituents know if you're getting rich in office, if you're using your position for personal gain, if you are representing them or yourself." He opened the folder and pulled out 2 forms, holding them up side by side like Exhibit A and Exhibit B. 2022, Vance said, gesturing to the first document. "Your disclosure. Total net worth, roughly $158,000. Modest, comfortable, but certainly not wealthy. You represented one of the poorest congressional districts in America. Median household income in your district is $46,000 a year. So, in 2022, you were doing a little better than your voters, but you were in the same universe." Vance dropped the 2022 form. It slid across the polished wood of the dais. 2024, Vance said, holding up the second form with 2 hands. 2 years later. Want to guess your reported net worth? Omar didn't respond. She stared at the table, her jaw set. $6 million to $30 million. Gasps. Actual, audible gasps from the gallery. The number was staggering. It wasn't an incremental increase. It was a lottery win. Your net worth jumped from under $160,000 to potentially $30 million. In 2 years. 2 years, Congresswoman. You either discovered the secret to alchemy, or something else happened. Vance leaned over the dais. "Let me guess which one. Your husband, Tim Minot, the E Street Group consultant turned venture capitalist turned winery owner. Quite the Renaissance man. Let's look at his businesses, because this is where the math gets creative." Vance pulled out a spreadsheet, his finger tracing the lines. "Rose Lake Capital, a venture capital firm investing in businesses. Your 2023 disclosure listed its value between $1,000 and $15,000. Basically, nothing. A rounding error." He paused. 2024 disclosure, $5 million to $25 million. From 0 to $25 million in 1 year. Then there's the winery, EST Crew. Fancy name? 2023 disclosure, up to $50,000. A hobby. 2024 disclosure, $1 million to $5 million. From $50,000 to $5 million overnight, Vance said, shaking his head. "While you were in Congress, representing the poorest district in Minnesota, making connections, taking meetings, your husband suddenly became a titan of industry." "Mr. Vice President, those valuations are based on projected—" "Stop," Vance ordered. "Congressional disclosure rules are very specific. You don't list the full value of companies your spouse co-owns. You list your spouse's individual stake, his equity. If he owns 10% of a $5 million company, you list $500,000, not $5 million. Vance picked up a memo. Your own office admitted you did it wrong. Quote, "The values on her disclosure form reflected the full value of the businesses rather than the value of her husband's individual shares." End quote. "Every other member of Congress gets this right," Vance noted. Corey Mills, April McLean Delaney, Brad Schneider. They list the stake. You listed the fantasy. Why? Because you wanted to look richer than you are? Or because you're hiding the fact that there's no money there at all? Vance pulled out a court document, stamped with a Rhode Island court seal. June 2024. Your husband and his partner, Will Haler, are being sued by an investor, Naeem Mohayaman. He invested $300,000. They promised him a 200% return. He got nothing. He claims fraud. But here is the smoking gun, Vance said, his voice dropping. In discovery, your husband's lawyer had to disclose the actual bank account balances of these multi-million-dollar firms. Vance held up the bank record. Rose Lake Capital. The firm you listed is worth up to $25 million on your federal disclosure form. Do you know how much money was in its bank account? The room was silent. 4244. Not $42 million, not $42,000, $42. Less than the cost of a tank of gas. EST Ventures. Another one of his firms. Bank account balance, 5 cents. A nickel. Laughter bubbled up in the gallery again, but it was angry laughter. So, while your husband's companies are being sued for fraud, while investors are claiming he stole their money, while bank accounts are empty, you are filing federal forms claiming a net worth of $30 million. You are living in luxury. Designer clothes, first-class travel, million-dollar valuations on paper. Meanwhile, Vance said, pointing to a chart of Minneapolis demographics, your district, the North Side, 22% poverty rate. Nearly 1 in 4 people you represent live below the poverty line. Families choosing between food and rent. Parents working 3 jobs. That is who you represent, Vance said, his voice vibrating with disdain. That is who voted for you. You ran on tax the rich. You ran on economic justice. But while they were struggling to buy groceries, you were inventing $30 million in wealth on federal forms. You didn't represent them, Congresswoman. You exploited them. You used their votes to build a brand, and then you used that brand to build a fantasy life of wealth that turns out to be nothing but smoke and mirrors and $42 bank accounts. Mr. Vice President, I can explain the valuation methodology, she tried, desperate to sound technical. You can explain it to the Ethics Committee, Vance said, slamming the folder shut, because filing false financial disclosures is a federal crime. The accusation of federal crimes hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. But Vice President Vance wasn't finished. He had stripped away the slay queen persona, dismantled the financial facade, and exposed the hollowness of the rhetoric. Now, he was going to attack the one thing Ilhan Omar claimed to care about most, her own community. We have one more topic to cover, Vance said, his voice devoid of the earlier sarcasm. It was now just cold, hard fact. And this one is the most painful, because it involves stealing food from children. The Feeding Our Future fraud, Vance announced. At the mention of the name, Omar flinched. It was a slight movement, a tightening of the shoulders, but the cameras caught it. For those watching at home who don't know, Vance explained, looking into the lens, Feeding Our Future was a non-profit organization. Beautiful name, beautiful mission. To feed hungry children during the COVID pandemic. To provide meals for kids in poverty, low-income families in your district. Kids whose parents work minimum wage. Kids who go hungry without school lunches. Federal grants, state funding, millions of dollars flowing in to feed children. Vance paused. Except they didn't feed the kids. They stole the money. $250 million, the largest pandemic fraud scheme in American history. 70 people indicted. Federal prosecutors. The FBI. A massive investigation uncovering fake meal sites, fake attendance records, fake children. They would report serving 10,000 meals a day, Vance said, shaking his head. In reality, they served 100. They filed for reimbursement for 10,000. The government paid. Easy money. That is $250 million stolen from programs meant to feed hungry children in Minneapolis. Your constituents' children. Vance turned to look at her. And you took money from them. He pulled out a new document, Federal Election Commission records. Donations to your campaign. From defendants. People who have been indicted. People who have pleaded guilty. Some who are already in federal prison. Vance read the names from the list. Safari Restaurant, Mukhtar Sharif, Liban Alishair, Abdi Nur Salah, all connected to the fraud. All gave money to your campaign. All bought access to you. All thought you would protect them. You claim you returned it, Vance acknowledged. Quote, a couple years ago. Very vague. Did you return it after they were indicted? After they were arrested? After reporters started asking questions? Independent reviewers suggest you received more than double what you publicly admitted to returning, Vance noted. But let's talk about the damage, not to you, to your district, to the Somali community you claim to represent. Vance leaned forward, his expression softening into something resembling pity, but his words were razor-sharp. These fraudsters, they were Somali-American. They used their community connections. They used their mosque affiliations. They used their ethnic ties to steal. 70 indictments, Vance emphasized. Most of them Somali immigrants, people you claim to protect. They committed massive fraud. They made your entire community look criminal. They fed every racist stereotype about refugee fraud. They hurt legitimate Somali businesses. They hurt honest community members trying to make it in America. And you took their money. The gallery was silent. This hit harder than the tax returns. This was a betrayal of blood and soil. You accepted donations from people who were stealing from starving children in your own neighborhood. You took their cash for your campaign to get re-elected. When reporters asked questions, did you denounce them immediately? Did you apologize to the kids who didn't get fed? Did you apologize to the honest Somali business owners whose reputations were ruined? No, Vance answered for her. You gave the minimum response required. You returned some money. You issued a bland statement. You claimed ignorance. Did you know? Vance asked suddenly. Did you know these donors were involved in fraud when you accepted their money? Omar shook her head, staring at the table. I would never. You didn't know they were running massive nonprofit organizations processing millions in federal funds with no visible operations, Vance pressed. You had no idea? You never asked where the money came from? Or did you know and just not care? Because the money was good. Because you needed it to beat Don Samuels in the primary. Mr. Vice President, as soon as the allegations came out, we acted, she whispered. You acted to protect yourself, Vance corrected. Not the kids, not the community, yourself. Vance gathered his papers into a single, neat stack. The hearing was effectively over. He had laid out the case. The personal enrichment, the state crimes, the insults to 9/11 families, the bigotry, the fake wealth, and finally, the complicity in stealing from the poor. 7 scandals, Vance summarized. 7 rounds. We've proven today that you paid your husband millions while having an affair. We've proven you broke state law. We've proven you minimized 9/11. We've proven you trafficked in anti-Semitism. We've proven you filed false financial disclosures claiming to be a multimillionaire while your husband's bank accounts held $42. And we've proven you took money from people who stole food from children. And through it all, Vance said, his voice rising for the final crescendo, you played the victim. You claimed Islamophobia. You claimed racism. You claimed persecution. But the evidence doesn't lie, Vance said, tapping the stack of documents. The bank records don't lie. The state boards don't lie. The victims don't lie. He leaned forward, delivering the final verdict from the dais. You do. You lie. That is what this hearing has proven beyond any doubt. Vance picked up his gavel. This committee will issue its final report in 30 days. Our recommendation will be censure, removal from all remaining committee assignments, and referral to the Department of Justice for potential criminal prosecution on federal disclosure violations. The evidence supports all three. The facts support all three. Justice demands all three. Bang! The gavel struck the wood. The sound was final, conclusive. This hearing is adjourned. The room exploded into noise, not chaos, but the release of tension held for hours. Reporters rushed for the exits. Gallery members stood up, some hugging, some crying. Nicholas Harros Jr. stood tall, looking down at the floor where Omar sat. She sat at the table for a long moment, broken, destroyed. Her lawyer gathered papers frantically, trying to shield her from the cameras, but there was nowhere to hide. She stood slowly, unsteady, and walked toward the exit, head down, defeated. As she passed Nicholas Harros Jr.'s row, he stood silent, just watching, making sure she saw him, making sure she remembered. She couldn't meet his eyes. She looked down and kept walking. The heavy oak door closed behind her. The sound echoed through the chamber. Final. Damning. Done. The heavy oak doors of the hearing room had closed, sealing the chamber, but the digital doors had just blown wide open. Within minutes of the gavel striking the sound block, the footage was no longer contained within the Senate archives. It was everywhere. The clip of Vice President Vance leaning forward, his voice dripping with incredulity as he asked, "Let me ask you about the money," became an instant viral sensation. It trended on X, formerly Twitter, within the hour. It dominated TikTok. It led the breaking news alerts on every major cable network. The phrase itself, "Let me ask you about the money," morphed into a cultural meme, a shorthand for finally demanding accountability from the untouchable. But it wasn't just the catchphrase, it was the specific, granular details that captivated the internet. The revelation of the $42.44 bank balance for a company supposedly worth $25 million became the subject of endless mockery. Someone set the exchange to a trap beat. Another user remixed the vice president's timeline of payments with a Law and Order sound effect. For the first time, the complexity of campaign finance law had been distilled into a bite-sized, undeniable narrative of greed. Back in the halls of Congress, the silence was deafening. Usually, when a member of the squad came under attack, the defense was coordinated and instantaneous. There would be press conferences, tweets about structural racism, and accusations of bullying. Today, there was nothing. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez retweeted a generic post about climate change. Rashida Tlaib focused her feed on international aid. Ayanna Pressley posted about voting rights. Not one of them mentioned Ilhan Omar. Not one. The political calculus had shifted violently. Defending Omar was no longer a stance against the establishment. It was a defense of fraud, of taking money from starving children, of minimizing 9/11. And even her closest allies knew that was a hill they would die on. The Minnesota Democratic Farmer Labor Party, DFL, held an emergency meeting that evening. The details leaked to the press almost immediately. The tone inside the room wasn't defensive. It was frantic. Evaluating next steps, the statement read, a polite political euphemism for how do we force her out without admitting we enabled her for 7 years? But the most devastating blow didn't come from the DFL or the squad. It came from her own base. The next morning, The Star Tribune ran a full-page open letter. It wasn't signed by Republican operatives. It was signed by 15 prominent Somali-American business leaders, imams, and community organizers, people who had endorsed her, fundraised for her, and defended her against every previous scandal. The text was searing. We are devastated by the testimony presented today. We believed Representative Omar represented our values, our community, and our hopes. We were wrong. By accepting donations from those who stole from our children, and by engaging in financial deception, she has betrayed the trust of the Somali people. We call for her immediate resignation. It was a political death sentence. The community she claimed to protect had publicly disowned her. Even CAIR, Council on American Islamic Relations, which had hosted her at countless galas, quietly scrubbed her photos from their website. The champion of the community page returned a 404 error. The media cycle was relentless. Fox News ran segments on the Feeding Our Future connection for 12 hours straight. CNN struggled to find a panelist willing to defend her. But the emotional climax of the aftermath came on Sunday night, on 60 Minutes. Nicholas Harros Jr. sat in his living room for the interview. He looked different than he had in the hearing room, less tense, though the grief was still etched into his features. Behind him, on the mantel, sat a framed photo of his mother, Frances, smiling in the sunshine of a pre-9/11 world. She finally heard me, Harros told the interviewer, his voice quiet and steady. For 5 years, I tried to make her understand what those words, "some people did something," actually felt like. I tried to explain that she wasn't just dismissing a historical event, she was dismissing my mother. The camera zoomed in on his face. In that room, with the vice president watching, with the cameras rolling, she couldn't run. She couldn't call me an Islamophobe. She couldn't deflect. She just had to sit there and listen. She had to look at me. Harros paused, looking at the photo of his mother. Justice doesn't bring her back. It doesn't undo the last 20 years. But it matters. Truth matters. For a long time, I felt like my mother's death was being used as a political prop, or worse, treated as an inconvenience. Today, I feel like she was honored. Today, the truth won. The interview was watched by 14 million Americans. It was the final nail in the coffin of the victimhood narrative. Ilhan Omar wasn't the victim of a smear campaign. She was a politician who had hurt people, real people, with names and faces, and had finally been forced to answer for it. The fallout from the hearing wasn't just rhetorical, it was tangible. The wheels of justice, often slow and grinding, had been greased by the vice president's intervention, and the results began to manifest in the streets of Minneapolis. Maria Rodriguez, a third-grade teacher at Whittier International Elementary in Omar's district, had spent 3 years shouting into the void. She had filed complaints about missing school funds, money meant for science kits, reading programs, and art supplies that had simply vanished into the labyrinth of non-profit partners connected to the fraud scheme. For 3 years, she had been ignored, stonewalled, and told to stop causing trouble. 3 weeks after the hearing, her phone rang. It was the Minnesota Department of Education. They weren't calling to dismiss her complaints. They were calling to apologize. The audit Vice President Vance had alluded to was complete. Investigators had traced $400,000 in missing education funds directly to shell companies linked to the donors Vance had named. The assets had been frozen and seized. Maria stood in her classroom as the delivery trucks arrived. New textbooks, science equipment still in the plastic, boxes of art supplies. She held up a copy of The Very Hungry Caterpillar, the cover bright and new. "My kids deserve this," she told the local news crew, tears welling in her eyes. "They deserve books. They deserve a chance. For years, I felt like our representative was stealing their future to pay for her own. Today, it feels like we got a little bit of it back." A few blocks away, in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood, the atmosphere was shifting too. Jamal Hassan, a Somali immigrant who had come to America with nothing in 2003, owned a small restaurant that had been devastated by the Feeding Our Future scandal. When the indictments dropped, business had plummeted by 60%. Customers, wary of the stigma attached to Somali businesses in the district, had stayed away, assuming corruption was endemic. But after the open letter, after the hearing, the customers started coming back. "She hurt all of us," Jamal said, serving lamb biryani to a table of regulars who had returned for the first time in months. "She made people think we were all thieves. She made people look at us with suspicion. But when the community stood up, when we signed that letter, people saw the difference. They saw that there are honest immigrants working hard, and there are corrupt politicians stealing. We are not the same." Jamal's business doubled in a month. The cloud of suspicion had lifted, replaced by a renewed respect for a community that had cleaned its own house. Politically, Ilhan Omar was in a death spiral. A primary challenge from Don Samuels, a respected black community leader and former city council member, had gone from a long shot to a statistical inevitability. Internal polls showed Samuels leading by 18 points, a margin that was historically catastrophic for an incumbent. Omar's approval rating in her own district sat at 22%. She had retreated into isolation. She moved out of her D.C. apartment and into a gated house in Minnetonka, shielded by private security. There were no town halls, no interviews, no defiant tweets. Her social media accounts, once a fire hose of hot takes and provocations, went silent. Rumors of a divorce from Tim Minot began to circulate. Stories of financial stress, mounting legal bills, and a marriage built on campaign funds collapsing under the weight of scrutiny. The squad moved on without her. The Democratic Party moved on without her. The voters moved on without her. In the final moments of this saga, the voice of the narrator returns, echoing the sentiments of Vice President Vance's closing gavel. This wasn't just about the downfall of one corrupt congresswoman. It wasn't just about Ilhan Omar. It was a stress test for the American political system. For too long, identity politics had been weaponized as a get-out-of-jail-free card. Accusations of racism, Islamophobia, and bigotry had been used to silence legitimate questions about fraud, theft, and ethics. Ilhan Omar had bet her career on the idea that her identity was a shield strong enough to deflect any fact. She believed that no one would dare ask about the money, about the marriage, or about the 9/11 comments for fear of being canceled. She was wrong. When the bank records were laid bare, when the victims spoke, and when the Vice President of the United States demanded a yes or no answer, the shield shattered. Facts, it turned out, were stubborn things. Evidence didn't care about your religion. Bank accounts didn't care about your race. Justice didn't care about your Twitter following. The hearing proved that the era of corruption without consequences was ending. It sent a message to every other politician hiding behind a carefully curated persona. We have the receipts. We have the documents. And we are no longer afraid to ask the question. As the camera fades on the empty hearing room, the dust motes dancing in the light of the projector, the lesson remains clear. You can play the victim. You can deflect. You can hide. But eventually, someone is going to ask about the money. And when they do, you better have an answer. Justice is real. Accountability is coming. And for Ilhan Omar, the bill had finally come due.